Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us for yet another LIDNUG free virtual event. Today we're going to have Dave Baskin that's going to be talking to us about fundamentals of AngularJS Directives. Before I hand over to Dave, I'll say that this is the longest string of events we've had in association with Wintellect. And we have many more to come. Anyways, before I hand over, a bit of housekeeping. First off, thank you to our sponsors. That's Orgsweb, Telerik, Innerworkings, Syncfusion, Pluralsight, and Wintellect Now. I want to thank you guys for the continuous support for the last many years, and let you also know that without your help, we simply wouldn't be able to do what we're doing today for our members. If you need to get hold of us and contact with any of the LIDNUG staff, feel free to send an email to info@lidnug.org. You can also catch us on the social with twitter.com/lidnug, facebook.com/lidnug. Also, all of our recordings is also uploaded to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/lidnug. Upcoming events for April, we have another LIDNUG and Wintellect event. That's 0 to Node.js in 90 minutes with Josh Lane. We also have Dan Warlin, who's going to be doing the AngularJS Jumpstart guide. To see more of our events, we have bookings all the way up until June. Go to lidnugevents.eventbrite.com. And Dave Baskin is today's presenter. He's a senior consultant at Wintellect. This is Dave's first LIDNUG event, and he's going to be talking to us about the fundamentals of AngularJS Directives. If you need to ask questions of the presenter regarding the presentation itself, the topic, use the Q&A manager. There's a Q&A tab at the top of your screen. Type in your question, and it will show up for the presenter. Please remember you can only have one active question at a time in here, and as they get cleared out, you should be able to ask more questions. If you have questions of LIDNUG, or you have issues with audio or anything else, locate any of the members from LIDNUG. They will have the LIDNUG in square brackets prepended or to their name. So just double-click on their name and send them a message. The 10-year geography today is not surprising, pretty much all over the world, the majority of them in North America, Europe, and APAC. Got a few from South America and also in the African regions. I want to hand over to Dave. Dave, welcome, and thank you very much for coming and presenting for our members.
Well, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay?
You're just fine, Dave.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad to be here today. Let me see, get my screen shared here. Okay. Can everybody see that okay?
Fine. The resolution is a little bit big for the screen sharing here.
Is that better?
That's better.
Okay. Great. Thanks. So my name is Dave Baskin. I'm a senior consultant with Wintellect, and today we're going to talk about AngularJS. This, of course, is a .NET user group, so you might question why we might be talking about AngularJS, and it's a good question. We've, over the last year or so at Wintellect, have been using AngularJS in a number of projects, and it's become a great tool for us. Most of our backends that we've worked in have been still ASP.NET and MVC applications, but AngularJS, of course, is a front-end application, and it works well. It's a very good companion framework for ASP MVC applications. So it is worth worth looking into and looking at the potential of using it on your own projects. I think you'll be very happy with it. Many times when we were first looking at Angular, there was stories about people being able to take some of the crazy things you have to do in JavaScript, and Angular seemed to have a good mechanism for more easily creating the front-end experiences, and where instead of a whole lot of JavaScript code, you're able to narrow down and separate the code into more reusable, more usable chunks of application, and so AngularJS has also been helpful in working through the issues of trying to optimize your front end and get a good development patterns in place to be able to create the front end of your application very efficiently. So we've been real happy with it, and like I said, we've used it on a couple of projects, and Wintellect just in general is we provide consulting services, and we also provide online training services, and as well as an online video training as well. So when we look at AngularJS, I like to look at the components here. In this diagram works well for me. What we're going to talk about today is the directive, but I'll give you a quick overview of how the components all fit together here if you don't have a lot of experience with AngularJS. Of course, we have a view that is what the end user sees. We have a controller that orchestrates the activity of that view, and we have a piece of data in the middle that's a function in the middle called the scope that basically manages it's able to marshal data between your view and your controller. So this is where your binding comes in. So model data on your controller is published through the scope and then can be bound to input elements, etc. like that. Then when events or certain things happen with your view, then the scope also works to marshal that those events back to your controller so you can act on those in different ways. The controller might call different services within that you've created, whether it's calls to back-end web services or something internal to your application, maybe some messaging services internal to your application. And then a router would basically control the different user interface elements that come up in a single page application. So that's that. Even though Angular doesn't have to be used in a single page application mode, a router can manage those creating the views and creating controllers, instantiating those, hooking those together, etc. Well, like I said, we're going to talk about today the piece down at the bottom, which is the directives. The directives are basically HTML markup that is included in your view to accomplish certain purposes, create visual elements, work with the DOM within the view in whatever ways your application needs. So when we talk about, before we talk about just some prerequisites for this course, now this is, I don't want to scare anybody off. A lot of this is overview, so it still may be useful to everybody if you do not have a lot of Angular experience. But when you start working with directives, knowing the fundamentals of the other parts of AngularJS is very helpful. And of course, AngularJS is a JavaScript framework, so it runs in the browser, and so we're not going to dig into the depths of JavaScript here. We're making certain assumptions that you know at least enough JavaScript to know what I'm talking about when I display some code coming up. So hopefully, like I said, I don't want to scare anybody off, but maybe it might be useful if you do not have a lot of experience yet with these. I would recommend if our video online training course has a whole series on mastering AngularJS that we're real proud of, and it goes through in depth all of the details of AngularJS. And as well as there's some other courses about JavaScript and then backend and etc. So this may be helpful if you're trying to get up to speed as well. So when we look at directives, what are directives? Well, directives are the prescribed way of working with the DOM, the document object model. So looking at the pieces of AngularJS, the components that we looked at before, when you're working with the DOM, you really need to do that in directives. If you're doing DOM manipulation in your controller or your services, then you're probably not doing it in a very good way. And the directive is really a way to separate the things that you do with DOM manipulations, creating elements, subscribing to events, etc. We'll keep that out in a separate component. That gives you a nice separation concerns with the other components in your application there. The directives can be used to add new functionality to existing HTML elements. So you can modify HTML elements and have them behave differently than they normally do within the browser. So you can augment the functionality, and we'll see a lot of examples here in a little bit. We can create brand new markup. We can actually create new elements and be able to create an element that represents, say, like a single visual control, for example. So we can, the directives have the ability to do, create markup, nested markup, whatever is useful for your application, and then be able to reuse those directives throughout your application in different ways. And of course, the directive itself defines the logic for the user interface element. So it's going to define the JavaScript that would, for instance, subscribe to events or manipulate data elements within the DOM or create new DOM elements. So that's the purpose and the drive behind directives there. And given this is a .NET user group, I thought I'd take a moment and look at some of the parallels between directives and XAML controls. In the past, I've done plenty of Silverlight and WPF work, and one of the things that really attracted me to AngularJS was some of these parallels. It seemed to be that there were things that you did with XAML controls that were very similar with directives. And it's not perfect parallel, but it I think will give you some comfort if you do come from a XAML background. So for example, element directives, we create new markup. It's very similar to creating custom controls. So in our XAML, we might create a new markup element that defines our custom control. And of course, HTML and XAML are very similar in the fact that they are both based on XML syntax. So there's some similarities there. Of course, it's not equal, obviously, but some similarity. When you work with XAML, a lot of times you work with view models if you're using the MVVM pattern. And within Angular, you have this idea of a scope and a controller, and it's doing the same thing about marshaling data from your view into your model. And so, for example, within a view model, you might use the iNotifiedPropertyChanged event to publish changes in your model data. Within Angular, you have this idea of a digest loop. A digest loop is kind of doing the same thing, except that it's actually going through your model data, the watches that you've set up, and checking for things that are changing. So that gives you, that basically in effect gives you the same result, is when model data changes or when view data changes, we can make that data go back and forth. When you're dealing with events, say like a click event on a button, in a MVVM pattern, you would use an I command to implement something that would allow you to respond to a click event. Well, in Angular, you have this same thing that you basically can call a function or execute some code that basically when an event occurs. You have the idea of attributes on your directives that basically kind of parallel dependency properties. So your dependency properties were set up. These are the configuration properties for my control. Well, you can use the same thing with attributes and define different attributes that can control your directive. And where you have an idea of I-value converter, which was responsible for converting data from model form into view form and back and forth, Angular directives have a similar idea with parsers and formatters. And so again, it's moving data from view form, from a textual view form to whatever binary forms in the back end. So let's look at form directives. We'll start off here and look through basically a number of directives that are built into Angular and how they're used and what services they provide. And then at the end, we'll actually step into a few custom directives and see how those are implemented. But this hopefully, as we step through these directives and see how they work, you can see basically the power that you can implement within your own directives. So when we have a form here, this is a pretty simple form. We've got an email address. The email address is required, and we have a button that's cancel and save, for example. So when you use this form within Angular, it automatically picks up some augmented functionality, and we'll look at some of that. But let's step through some of the directives you can incorporate into a form. So the first thing we want to look at is a directive called NGModel. And what that does is that is specifying the binding from this input field into your model data. So in our scope that we've created within our controller, we've created a user object, and the user object has a property called an email address. So when I specify an NGModel, I'm specifying what model data that I'm actually binding to. And in this case, it's my email address on my user object. And just specifying the NGModel there, you can see that automatically the email address appears in the input form. So this is a two-way binding. It comes from the model to the input form, and as I change the input form, it'll go back to the model. So then once we have set up our model, we now can use some other augmented functionality of the form. Angular provides some state information about the status of the form. One of those pieces of state is the setting a class value, a class to the form itself, depending on the state of the form. So there's two classes that we can look at. One is NGValid and one is NGInvalid. And so basically that says whether the form itself is valid or invalid. And a form is valid or invalid if each of the individual input elements from the form are valid or invalid. So you can see that as I have a email address, that email address is in a valid form right now. But if I change that so it's not a valid form of email address, you see that the background color is changed because I've set a style for invalid to be this light coral form. As soon as I change it back into a valid email address, you can see that the background color changes because the class is being applied to that form. Well, the Angular also provides two other ideas where you have a dirty and a pristine, meaning that the form has been changed or the form has been modified. So if I haven't edited anything on the form, I've got a light gray background. And as soon as I edit the form, you see the background changes because now this class has been applied to the form, the NGDirty class. So along in the similar idea then is not only do you have these classes that are applied, but you also have some additional state information that's applied to your scope so that you can use that in various ways. So for example, we can use this input field, and what we've done is we've added a couple of paragraph blocks that are in this form of help block, which is this is just bootstrap style classes that I'm using. And we can use another directive called NGShow. Now NGShow, basically you give it an expression to evaluate, and the expression evaluates either to true or false. And if it's true, then this element will be shown. If it's false, then the element will be hidden. So we use this now with the test from our state information that we've collected. So the Angular has applied to our scope. It has applied a user form object. This user form basically comes from the name of the form itself, and for each input field on that form, we have a property, and each property then has a set of state information. So this property, for example, has an error state information, and this error is a collection of specific states. So for each error that might occur, it's going to return a true if that error is applicable. So error.required is saying that if the input field has not passed the required validation, then this is going to be true, which means that I'm going to use NGShow to show this text. So let's see what happens here. So if I erase my email address, I see that the email address is required now shows up. So the $error.required is set on my scope there. Now if I start typing my email, but it's not in a valid form, then the $error email required error is set to true. And so now the second message comes up. But as soon as I type in a valid email, then both of those messages are hidden at this point. So then in addition to this status, it also keeps information. Not only can we use the error state, but for the email address, we can also keep a valid or invalid state. And then we're going to use a new directive called NGClass. NGClass allows us to set class names to a particular element based on, again, an expression valuation that evaluates to true or false. And this is in the form of an object. So the object properties represent the class names. Here I'm using a hasError class name, which again is a bootstrap class name. And it's testing to see if from the user form the email address is invalid, then I want to apply this hasError field. So if I go and I delete my email again, I still see the same address, the same message that I was using before, but then now you see that the input field has this kind of standout red around it, which is the way Bootstrap has defined that class. So if I go back and type in my email again, that class is removed. So since this is an object form, you can actually apply multiple classes based on different tests to that element. So we talked about how you can respond to events. Well, let's look at the NGClick directive. The NGClick directive basically will call this expression, whatever expression evaluates to, it will execute that expression when the button is actually clicked. So in our case, we've actually published two functions on our scope, cancel changes or save changes. And when I click these buttons, it's actually going to call that and do something. In my case here, I just set it to specify some text. You click the cancel button or the save button, for example. So this is a way you can respond to events in your control for some reason, for whatever reason fits your application there. So the last thing we want to do is actually, we want to disable the save button. And we're going to look at some additional state here. We look at a directory called NGDisable, which is basically kind of like NGShow or NGHide, but in this case, it's actually disabling something that's functional. In this case, it's a button. We're disabling this button if the user form, this is a state that's kept for the entire form at this point. So the entire form knows whether it's dirty, and the entire form knows whether it's invalid. And so if it's not dirty or it is invalid, then it's going to disable this button. So if I go and I change my email, I remove it, you notice that the save button is disabled. And if I go type that back in, then I get my save button back. So you can see right here where Angular has provided some interesting additional functionality that's very helpful when you're dealing with input forms. Now, of course, what you see there, and some people don't like this, but you see that we're putting we're augmenting our markup. We're adding additional properties in our markup. And so if you're more used to say like unobtrusive JavaScript, this might rub you the wrong way. But in the end, personally I don't have problems with this syntax, because you're able to quickly look at a form and determine exactly what it's doing just by looking at the markup there. So there is a trade-off here, and you can decide for yourself whether that trade-off is valid or not. So let's look at some other ways we can augment the functionality of an input field. For example, we already looked at the required field. So if I type and I leave the field blank, then the text value, the error required field comes into play. But we can also use things like ngMinLength, ngMaxLength. So I can specify that this input field needs a certain number of characters, a certain minimum, certain maximum number of characters. So if I start typing characters, you can see that if it's less, then I get my first message, and the error is min length, which is associated with the minimum length. That is the error name. And then, of course, if I go off the other end, we get the other error that it's too many characters. We also can map our text entry to a regular expression pattern using the NGPattern directive. So this gives us the ability to check to make sure that our text is in the right form. So if I type anything else that's not correct, then it'll specify the pattern error, and so you can ensure you validate your input through using a regular expression. So another type of input you might use is a select element. So you can see a select element just has a set of options, and corresponds to a drop-down list, and you can select one of the items on the list. Usually there's a value associated with each of the items, and then there's a display, a text that's displayed in the drop-down. So Angular provides a select attribute, a directive that will allow you to pull data from your model and create your selection from your model data. So for example, here we're looking at the NG options directive, which is applied to the select class. And this is in a specific form. So basically what you do is you tell it the collection that you're interested in. In this case, it's data.allValues, which you can see from my scope. I've created a data object, and I've created a property called allValues, which is just a list of each of the values that I'm interested in. And I also create a selected value, which receives the value that is actually selected. I can use the NG model to bind to that value. So now once you've specified the collection, you have to give it a variable name that you're going to use for that collection. And then you give it a representation of the text that's going to be in that collection. So here we're just using the value. It's just a list of strings, so we're just going to use the value to display the list. And so we can see we've got exactly what we had before, but we're pulling that from our scope. Well, you can do not only a list of individual string values, but you can do a list of objects, for example. So again, we provide it the collection that we're interested in. We give a variable name, and now instead of just using the variable itself, we're going to use v.name, which will pull from this field. And so you can see now that we've got the same thing we had before, except the difference is now we're actually passing in the selected value is receiving the entire object for what we've selected. This may or may not be what you want to do. There may be reasons that you want to do that, but more than likely you probably just want the ID for that selected value. So we can add to our specification that we want to use the ID. That's what's going to be the return value. The name is going to be the text that's displayed in the select value. And so once we do that, then we actually get a selected value that is what we expect. So we're actually pulling the ID from our selected values there. Let's see. So we can also use an idea of grouping within a selection. So we've got in our collection, we've got a type of red and green, and we can say group by, we can add to our specification that we want to group by type. And so we've added everything else is the same, we've just inserted that. And what that gives you is a selection where you're actually using grouping. You're still selecting exactly what we were doing before, but now we have some ways to organize that you might use, say, in a large selection list. Not only can we use a collection, but we can also use an individual object. So here I've got a single object with a set of key values, alpha, beta, etc., and each of those points to an object. So now what we want to do is we want to change our expression so that instead of using a collection, we're going to provide it the single instance of the object. And then now we need two variables. We need a key variable and a value variable. And we still want to return the ID that comes from the value. But what we're going to do here for the text, we're going to actually create an expression that is basically will manipulate the key and the value data into a text value that we want to display on the dropdown. So we're going to take the key value, add some parentheses around it, and add the name. And so you can see now for my text value, I've got a combination of the key and the text. So I'm looking at Peter's question. He had, am I understanding correctly that AngularJS has built-in understanding of the email addresses? So HTML5 does. HTML5 has a new input types, and one of those types is email address. So Angular is just kind of augmenting that functionality. And Jaya is asking a question, can the collection of values be retrieved from the model? And that's hopefully what I'm showing. Maybe that was asked a few minutes ago before I got here, but hopefully you see that we've got a model, and that model is you can create whatever data makes sense in your model. Most of the time, your model will, of course, call a web service to pull the data elements that you need instead of hard coding it within your application here. But yeah, you can use whatever model makes sense for your application there. And I think that was it for select. We have a question that says, this looks to me very much similar to Knockout.js. So that is true. There is a lot of things that are similar to Knockout.js, but the scope of Knockout.js is a lot narrower focus than Angular. Angular is a larger framework in that it addresses a lot more things than Knockout does. Knockout specifically for binding, but Angular provides additional features, including binding and routing and a lot of other things that Knockout really doesn't address. So let's look at binding text values. So if you've used Angular a little bit, you've probably seen the mustache syntax, so the double braces. And what this does is it sets up a one-way binding so that whatever value comes from my data object, the property, that text value property will be placed into the middle of my paragraph text, which you see here. Well, the equivalent of this is an NGBind attribute, which NGBind will basically take your text and set the inner text of that element. So basically, these do equivalently the same thing. But when it becomes more interesting when you start binding HTML text. So we've added to our scope here, we've added an HTML value, and the HTML value actually has some elements in it. It's got a strong tag, it's got a paragraph text, it's got a emphasized text as well. So you can see if I pass the HTML value into my bind, it basically does HTML encodes it and then prints it out as text. So this is probably not what you wanted. You probably wanted the paragraph text to be included in your document there. So Angular does provide a NGBind HTML as well. But when you start working with HTML elements, you want to be careful that you want to make sure that you trust the HTML that's actually going to be added to your document. So, for example, if you're entering a rich text form, which the text form is saved in HTML, and if you want to display that HTML, you want to ensure that somebody hasn't put script tags in it or other style options or whatever you consider safe. So Angular provides it provides a sanitation service that it sanitizes your HTML. Let me try saying it that way. It sanitizes your HTML so that you can trust the HTML that will be rendered into your document. So you'll notice here when I do the bind HTML on my first value, it only has some simple safe elements. It's just strong tag, emphasized. So these are okay. But in my unsafe HTML, you notice that I've got something like I've got a style here where I've specified the font size. I've got an unclick handler. So I've got, what happens when I click. But of course, when that HTML is bound, I'm not getting a click handler, I'm not getting the style as well, because Angular has sanitized that for me. So this is a very good thing. So you want to make sure that you trust the HTML. But what if you do trust the HTML? Well, Angular provides another service to allow you to do this as well. So in this case, Angular has a service called the Strict Contextual Escaping Service, so $SCE. And so what this does, it basically puts a marker on your HTML to say that, hey, I trust this HTML text. Go ahead and render that to the browser. So now you can use the ng bind HTML just like you did before. You may have seen in previous versions of Angular ng bind unsafe HTML, and so that's been removed at this point. And now this is the proper way to bind trusted HTML. So you basically use the SCE service and you call a method on the service. In this case, we're calling the trust as HTML service, and it says it's going to wrap this and say this is trusted, so that when it renders, you can see that the style came into play, and I can also click now, so my click handler's activated as well. We have a question that says, oh, okay. Well, there's a question of what are the requirements to set up AngularJS. So AngularJS is a browser it's code that runs in the browser. So whatever mechanism that you're using to include other browser source files, so like jQuery or underscore or whatever you're happen to be using, then you would do the same thing. Angular is just a set of JavaScript files that you include in your browser. There's no server-side element to this. There are other libraries that you can they can work with Angular, but on the back end, but Angular is strictly the front end. All right. Excuse me. So let's look at some of the ways that you might manipulate the DOM itself. What that means is there are directives that you can use to change what's in the DOM, and this is actually generating new elements based on the markup that you've entered, and it's a way to kind of radically alter your DOM based on the requirements for your application. So, for example, if we use the NGIf directive, NGIf, again, you provided an expression that evaluates to true or false, and if that evaluates to true, then the internal, all the child elements under the NGIf will be included in the DOM. Otherwise, they'll be actually removed from the DOM. So in here, I've actually created a checkbox input, and I can then click or unclick that checkbox and to show my first page or my second page. And so that's a very simple way to include certain elements in your application depending on what you need. You might have some need to only show this if you're a system administrator, for example. So you could do something like that. NGIf is one. NGSwitch is another one. NGSwitch is very much like a switch statement that you would use in JavaScript. You can switch on a particular item, and then you can just display elements based on which switch value is chosen. So we've got value 1, value 2, or we can also do the default, just like you can in a switch statement that you're used to. So here I've created a radio button, and with each of the values, 1, 2, or some other value. And then as I switch between the radio buttons, you can see that the different elements are actually rendered into the DOM there. We can also use one called NGInclude. And NGInclude basically takes an ID of basically a template ID, and it renders that template within the NGInclude. So what do I mean by that? So the NGInclude takes a reference and it uses this idea of a template cache. A template cache is a cache that Angular has created to allow you to have a number of textual markup elements saved as a template that you can then reuse at certain points. So we've defined two here. We've just defined a page 1 and we defined a page 2, and then we mark these as a template using the text/NGTemplate value here. That's the type for the script value. So within that is actually just whatever markup that you want. And the template cache basically will, once a template ID is referenced, it will check to see if that is in the page or if it's already loaded in the cache. And if it's not, it'll read that from the page and load that into the template cache for you, so that you now have a very quick switching between templates. And so I've set up a radio button here, for example, that will change the names of the template. So I've got detail page 2 is the name, which corresponds to the ID that I've specified here. And so now I can switch between page 1 and page 2. And this is a way to give very dynamic content on your web page very easily. You could switch between detail list and detail views very quickly, and it provides a nice interface as well. If you're working with a SPA application, there's even another layer on top of that we won't get into, but there's router functionality, and in the Angular UI project, the UI router, which is what most people are using these days, that allows you to specify routes to dynamic content rather than just a simple include is like what we're looking at here. So let's look at a couple of questions here. Could I use validation with NGSwitch? So the nice thing about that is depending on your NGSwitch will be, you'll have within your controller, you'll know what's being displayed, and so you can change your validation based on what's actually displayed. So I think you would do most of that within your controller, if hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, you can use the validation along with the switch. Let's see. So the template cache does not use local storage. Template cache is just it's a in memory, as far as I know. Now there may be an optimization there that it might use local storage, but as far as I know, it's all in memory. And you probably wouldn't put a whole lot of things in your cache. You would probably put little snippets that you want to reuse over and over. Also, the cache could go out to the server to pull in things from the template cache as well. So it doesn't all have to be within your JavaScript page. So the repeat directive is fun because it allows you to repeat a set of elements within your page based on a lot of different criteria. You can, for example, the syntax is, again, very similar to the select, where I've specified the ng repeat. And what this is saying is all this elements, the table row and all the children elements will be repeated for each element in my collection. So I provided the collection, and then I provided a variable to use within that collection. And that collection, then I can use the mustache syntax to then bind to each property of my collection, each property of each individual item in my collection there. And we can see we've got a nice table. The table itself is formatted using Bootstrap, so there's a little bit more going on. So you can also, just like you did with a select statement, you can use an object. So here, instead of sending a collection, I'm going to send it an object. You specify two variables that you want to use, a key and a value. And so now I can use the key and I can use the value and any properties on the value. So again, we get a nice repeat there as well. When you're within a repeat, there's certain state information that's provided for you, so you can do interesting things if you so choose. So Angular provides a number of state variables: index, first, middle, last, even, odd. And so what those are is based on the current item that you're in within that collection. These values will be set according to where you are in the collection. So index will, of course, be the index into the collection, whether it's the first record, whether it's one of the middle records, whether it's last, whether it's an even or an odd. So you might use some of those states, so for example, to color your even and odd rows, different apply classes to your even and odd rows if you'd like. So we can also apply filters to my collection. So in this case, I'm going to apply a filter that selects every object that passes this test, which says the type is red. So I can then get a subset of these items, and you can see where the table now is filtered down by just the items that are red. So we've got a few questions coming up. Can I use NGRepeat to loop within this specific number, IG from 1 to 10? What you would have to do, what normally you do, is you provide a filtered collection within your model. So if you wanted to only display the first 3 items here, for example, you might publish an items collection with just the first 3 records, and you manage it that way. So, for example, you might do that if you were paging data, for example. How is the CSS specified? Does it have to do with the keyword? The CSS, well, for the table itself, this is Bootstrap. I'm using the Bootstrap styles, so just applying the table class gives it this nice look with the vertical bars and things like that. If I wanted to add a class to a specific table data element, then I could use like an NG class and give it an expression to evaluate, things like that. And let's see. There was something wrong with even and odd. True, false, true, false, true, false, false, true, false, true. No, I guess not. So yeah, that's there was a question whether there was even and odd was representing correctly, and it looks like it was just that's not the case. All right. So we can also filter, say, for example, by name. So excuse me, we're ordering by name. And so in this case, we're actually ordering by name in descending order. So it's going to go from the 2 down to 5, because those are in reverse alphabetical order there. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. John mentioned that the limit to can be used. That's I apologize, I forgot about that. The limit to filter can be applied to limit only, say, like the first 3 records. That is correct. Thank you. All right, we'll get to some of these questions here in a second. Another option is if you have elements that are, if you want to repeat a set of elements that are not all under a single parent element. So for example, I have a H4 followed by a paragraph. Those don't have a common parent. So there's also this idea of an NGRepeat start and an NGRepeat end. And so basically, when you mark these 2 elements, then everything between those 2 and inclusive will be repeated. And so you can see we do something like this, and we can get our header plus our paragraph. So there's ways to be kind of clever about what you're trying to repeat there. We have a question that says, while iterating through a collection, do I need to explicitly create an ID column for the row numbers? So you don't have to create an ID column, but there is an idea of a track by. That is another option that you could put on a repeat. You can do a track by a certain ID, for example, and that will allow you to update the records and keep track of the IDs. So there's more information in the Angular documentation if you want more information about that. All right. Let's see. How do you filter for nested JSON objects? For instance, inside items, there's another object, attendees, and inside of it. Well, it's all dot syntax. So if let's say type was a complex object, and in this case, type is just a single string, but if it was a complex object, you could continue to do type dot notation. You could do type dot name or type dot whatever property that you're interested in. So you can actually do that as well. Now, if you're specifically asking for filtering, I believe that type notation works in filtering as well, but I can't tell you that for sure. So, but I know it does work when you're talking about when you're using the one-way binding, the mustache syntax here. And so, does the table update when underlying data changes? And yes, it does. So if I've got, for example, some process that is updating my items list changes, and now we've added an ID 6, let's say, then what ends up happening is because Angular has put watching the collection on my items property, it will see that that collection has changed, and it will automatically update and re-render the table for me. So that's handled for you automatically. Okay, so that's for repeat directives. So one of the things that you can do, obviously, too, is respond to events. So we already saw like an NGClick, for example, and an NGClick you can respond to a click event. And we want to set up a couple of other event handlers. We want to use the blur and the focus, NGBlur and NGFocus. And what that is when you're exiting an input field, the blur event fires. When you are entering an input field, the focus event fires. So you can see as I click between each of these fields, you see that the event fires. Now, all I'm doing is just printing a message on the screen, but you can see that might be useful to, say, kick off a back-end search. I don't know what you might do with that. Another event, of course, is the mouse over events. You can add any of these mouse events, mouse down, enter, leave, etc., and you can deal with, do something interesting with mouse as those occur. And then you can also deal with key events. So I can look at key down, key press, or key up events. I can also get the shift status or the control status. So there's a number of ways you can deal with in your controller responding to event and doing something interesting, whatever that might be according to your application there. So I think I've hopefully given you a good whirlwind tour of the directives that are built into Angular. So now let's take another step and let's look at building our own directives. So when we're creating directives, we basically, a directive itself is a marker that says that this is a directive and it should be treated specially by the Angular framework. So you can mark an element, you can mark an attribute, and you can mark a directive as a class. So either way, you're able to specify that this is a directive. Then during the bootstrap process, Angular walks through the DOM and looking for these markers, and it gets the collection of these markers. And then what it does is it actually compiles these directives. And what that means is the directives are compiled by basically determining what DOM manipulation, DOM updates are provided. It's going to wire up any events that you need, anything like that. It's create scope, all these kind of things that basically allow this directive to participate in the Angular framework. So that's basically what a directive, the process that directives go through in these steps. So let's look at the simplest template, the simplest directive that we can create here. And it basically is just doing a simple template. So we're creating a directive, and that directive is called My Hello World. Well, you notice that My Hello World is in camel case, but when I apply that directive to this div element, you notice that it's changed. It's changed in what's called some people call it snake case or hyphenated case. So because HTML is generally case sensitive, you can use names within your JavaScript that make more sense in JavaScript. Camel casing is obviously very common, but then still be able to use that in your directives. But you have to just change the name. So it's a little bit, possibly a little bit confusing, but it allows you to basically have the best of both worlds. You don't have to use strange identifiers within your JavaScript, for example. And then a directive basically returns an object that tells Angular about this directive. And in this case, our object only has one property, which is the template. And the template just is simply a paragraph with the hello world embedded in it. And so you can see that just by applying this My Hello World to this div tag, it sets the inner HTML of this div tag to a paragraph tag with hello world. Now there's some aliases for this directive. So My Hello World can also be specified using, if you want to, you can actually add a property tag there, and that you might want to do that because you've got an HTML validator, for example. You can also prefix the element with a data or an X hyphen prefix, and that also gives you the same directive. Now, you might do this also if you want strict compliance with, say, HTML5 syntax. So this is a nice way to be able to still make sure that your HTML validates. So this is a directive that is applied through an attribute. Let's see a directive that is applied with an element. So now I'm creating a My Hello World 2 directive, and we've added an additional property. By default, directives are applied to attributes, but here we're saying that we can use either an attribute or an element. So we're restricting this directive to use either one of those. Otherwise, we still have the same template, but now we can actually create markup and use the My Hello World 2 as the name of the directive, and that gives you a new markup here that this might represent a custom control. It may represent some say like your Google Analytics tag or whatever that might be, and you can include that within whatever HTML you need to use that. It still uses the same prefixes. You can use other prefixes as well to get you the same thing. But in the end, the end result is that you still see the hello world as many times as you've referenced that. So this is a pretty simple directive. Let's look at a little more complex directive. Okay, so what do we want to do here is we've got a ng repeat. We're creating a table like we saw, and that table comes from items with two properties. There's an ID property and a text property. And when we present it, I've manually constrained the width of this column so that so we can truncate some of this text. This is lorem ipsum text, and we're not showing all the all the text, and we see that we're using the ellipses there to specify that, hey, there's more text available. And we're also using a title so that when you when you move the mouse over the text, it shows you the entire text. Well, we want to do a slight optimization here. And what we're going to do is I want certain text that is not overlapping. I do not want the title to display. So, for example, this is actually 102 will display completely in the within the column, and I want to hide the title in this case. So I don't want that to come up. So the way we do that is we create this directive, and this directive is now a little bit more complicated because we're doing some other things that you do with directives. And a more interesting directive is going to have a link function, which basically will start up and include the logic for the directive. So when I talk about a directive being compiled, it's basically a two-step process. There's a compile phase, which basically is used to manipulate the template, and then there's a link phase that basically will allow you to apply that template within the HTML DOM. And so our directive will use a link function to basically, we know at this point that we've got our element, we've got the directive, we've got everything, and we're ready to put that into the DOM and do something interesting to the DOM. So we create a my table title, and we're going to use this just like we did the title, but we're binding the data a little bit differently, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it's an attribute directive, and it's applied to the text column. And the link function, when it's called, when the directive starting up, the link function is applied. It's given a scope, just like your controller in Angular. And Angular has a scope. A directive can also have a scope. It either can be a scope that inherits from its parent, or it can be an isolate scope, and in this case, we're declaring it as an isolate scope, meaning that this directive has its own scope. So on that scope, I'm basically saying that I have a property, and I want to specify the binding for this property. So in my case, I'm saying the title comes from this attribute, my table title. Well, where is that? Well, that is actually the whatever value that you've put in the attribute directive itself. So you're basically binding the value that's specified by my table title directive. You're binding to that, and when that changes, the title value on my scope is actually going to change, and I can do something with it. So the equal sign here basically says that is the binding. It's going to bind to a particular value. You've got to provide it a value. Now this value is in my controller that is manipulating this page, but this title value is in my scope that's just for this directive. So I can actually watch. I can use a function on the scope called watch, and I can check to see when my title changes. Whenever it changes, I want to provide a function that is given the title text, and then I can do something interesting. In this case, all I'm doing is getting the raw element, and I'm doing a simple calculation. If the offset width is less than the scroll width, then I know it's an overflow text. And in that case, I do want to apply the title element and provide it the title text, which was passed to my watch function. Otherwise, I want to remove this attribute altogether. So when I do that, you can see that now I can still see my title, the tooltip that pops up. But when I go to this one, the tooltip doesn't pop up because it's constrained within that column. It's kind of a subtle difference, obviously. I mean, most users probably wouldn't even notice. But the point was really just to give you an idea of what you can do with an attribute directive. You're modifying how the title directive is actually going to work for this particular column. So that's an attribute directive. Now we've also got the idea of an element directive. So let's walk through that a little bit. So we've got here, we're creating an element directive called myTable. And underneath myTable, we've got a column definition. And each column will specify the header that's going to be displayed at the top of the column and the field, which is going to come from my data element. So I'm going to copy the ID from my list of items, or I'm going to copy the text from my list of items. So let's step through this directive here and look at the pieces of it. So we've defined our myTable directive, and we're going to restrict it to only elements because it's not quite as useful if you're trying to do this with something besides a table element. We specified this option called transclude. Transclude is true. Now this is something that sometimes people struggle with, but basically what it's saying is that when I say transclude is true, I am telling Angular that I am interested in the children of my element. So I'm interested in the myTable columns, which are children of myTable element. And so I don't want Angular to throw them away. I don't want to, I want those to be interpreted because those are directives too, and I want to give them a chance to also be instantiated. So just like a view has a controller, and the controller has the controller has a scope, directives can also have controllers, and I actually need this controller for a very specific purpose. So the controller itself, just like if you were creating a view controller, would be passed in the scope, and then the scope, in my case, I'm keeping an array of columns which contain the ID and text, and then I'm also providing a function that will basically add my column details to this array. Okay, so that's very simple controller, but it does the simple thing that I need, and this will be used then in my template. So I create a template that basically defines what my table is going to look like. Now this is an inline template. I could just have simply used a template that was defined, as we saw previously, with a script tag and reference that instead. But here I'm going to actually use an inline template. It's got a simple table. For each header, I'm using an ng repeat, and I'm going through each of the columns. The columns are in my scope there, and for each column, I'm going to print out the header field. The header field is what I've defined here. So I've defined in the first column it's going to be say ID, and the second column it's going to say lorem ipsum text. And then I define an empty body, and then I need this one other div here that I've hidden. It's a hidden div that I'm using, but it's got a very important Angular directive on it, which is NGTransclude. And the NGTransclude, this is important because I need to tell Angular where it should insert the children that I wanted to save. So once I told it transclude equal true, then I need to tell Angular that when I've created this template, I want to actually include the children elements within this div tag. So that gives me a nice little div tag that's hidden. But what ends up happening is those myTable columns will actually be included in that div. But since they are directives, they also get a chance now to instantiate themselves. Well, what they need to do there is basically, for each table column, I've created a separate directive. And what's interesting about this directive is that it's actually going to be communicating with its parent directive through its controller. So what I'm saying here is that I want to require the myTable controller, which would be the parent in this case. So it's myTable, that's the controller. It's going to pass this controller object to my child directive. And through that child directive now, it's passed into the link function. The link function then can use the add column function that I set up on my controller. So add column, it's basically to be able to call that, and it's going to pass in this scope variable. What's the scope variable? Well, again, I've created an isolate scope here, and that isolate scope has two properties, header and field. And those properties are pulled from the HTML. So I'm pulling header and I'm pulling field into my scope. I'm using, instead of the equals binding here, I'm using the @ sign, which basically binds the text value. So you got the value that was in the column. It's not going to try to interpret that value. It's not binding to that value. It's just pulling what I've actually entered into that field. So that gives me a scope object which has a header and field, and the scope object can then be passed to the add column. This add column then just will push it onto my collection, my array of columns. And because that changes, then the ng repeat will fire again. We'll basically refresh the HTML at this point. So the other thing that happens is I actually want to, in my link function for my table directive, I want to watch the collection. The collection I'm looking at is this table data, where that came from the scope, which is bound through the table data property, and it's using the equal syntax, which means that it's going to bind to the table data property. So it's going to look at this and say, okay, this is a property that I can model data that I can bind to, and that gives me the data that I need for my table. And then I can take that, and when that changes, I can basically find my body tag. I can find all the child table rows. I can remove the rows. And then I can go and I can use a map function, which is map is basically a JavaScript way to translate one collection of things into another collection of things that may be different. In this case, where I'm creating a collection of table rows and table columns. And so I create a row for each element in my table data. I'm passing in the table data, and for each element in my table data, I'm going to create a table row, and I'm going to append to that for each column in my definition. I'm going to append a table data element, and then I'm going to take and set the text to the value that comes from my items. So there's a lot of moving parts there, and hopefully I haven't scared everybody away, but I wanted to show that there's a lot of flexibility there. You have access to a lot of things that you can do within a directive. You can manipulate the DOM. You can bind to data elements that are passed in. You have a lot of good ways to do some interesting things within directives. So hopefully that gives you at least a taste. If you don't understand all the details, at least it gives you a taste of what you can do with directives. The AngularJS page, AngularJS.org, of course, provides some additional documentation, and they continue to work on this documentation. They're providing some updates almost every day here. If we look at, for example, if you want to dig into directives more, there's a whole section here on directives and building that in. Building your own directives and the other things that you can do with directives. So let me try to answer a couple of questions here. I will try to provide the code snippets here afterwards. I wasn't able to collect them all together before the meeting here, but I'll get those together and we can send out an update for that. Is it possible to separate directive template from the directive code? Yes. So here, like I was saying, I'm using a template, an inline template, but I could also use a template that was defined within my HTML document as using the script tag that we saw before. is the table directive code available for us? So yes, I will try to provide that as well. If you want another example too, in the directives, in Angular's documentation, down at the bottom, it talks about creating a directive, creating a directive that communicates. Where is it? Yep, I apologize. Let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, creating directives that communicate. It's the last entry on this page. And this is a very similar entry as well, where it's using tabs and panes. So this might be helpful as well, but I'll send you our update as well. The only other last thing I wanted to show you is there is a sister project called Angular UI, and Angular UI has a number of directives built into it. One of the interesting one is the NGGrid, which of course allows you to define a directive and define working with tables in a number of ways. So that might be very interesting. But the Angular UI has some additional things that they've not included in the main branch of Angular, but it's very useful tools. One of the most useful, one of the most popular is the UI router. UI router is probably at this point the de facto way to do SPA applications within Angular, so it's worth a look as well. Of course, we didn't have time in this talk to get into any of that, but that is very useful as well. So how compatible is AngularJS? Excuse me. The compatibility is pretty good for this version. So 2.0, I think, supports back to IE8. 1.2 and 1.3 supports back to IE8. However, in the 2.0 branch that they're moving forward with Angular, it will actually drop support for kind of non-modern browsers. We'll see what that means when we get to it. But obviously, now that Internet Explorer is also considered a modern browser, at least the latest version of it, it may not be quite as a problem as it may have been before. So we are using it on a project going back to IE9, and it works well for that. Was there any other questions? Like I said, we have a online training, and Wintellect now has a number of videos that focus on Angular, focus on JavaScript, focus on .NET technologies, ASP, MVC applications, etc. It covers a large gamut of technologies that might be interested. There is a free trial that you can use. If you use Baskin 13 as the promo code, you can get a free 14 days, I believe, to view as many of those videos as you want. And like I said, our Angular Mastering AngularJS series is very good to get into a lot of depth of AngularJS. Is it easy to create unit tests for directives? And that is really one of the nice things about Angular, that it really is it was built from the ground up with testing in mind, and because it tends to separate concerns very well, you can test things independently. So for example, your controllers that you might set up, because they're not depending on DOM manipulation, you can trust that your controllers, you can test all the methods of your controllers. You can mock out your services so that you can verify that it's actually calling the services with expected parameters, things like that. So it actually has a very good testing story. There's a couple of components that you can use alongside of it. One is Karma.js, K-A-R-M-A-J-S, and that allows that gives you a way to unit test your JavaScript very well. And then there's another tool called Protractor.js, which allows you to have a very good end-to-end testing story for your application. So you can test the full suite of your application, and it's very coupled to, works well with AngularJS. So those tools are worth checking out as well. So what else is there to explore in AngularJS beyond directives? Well, I would definitely say that this is a really good resource to start off. So start off on AngularJS. There is a number of videos. There's a step-by-step tutorial you can walk through that provides a lot of good information. Then when you get into developer side, there's a developer's guide, which shows kind of a lot of how-to kind of articles, or basically describes the overall purpose and point of the different technologies. And then when you get into it, the different directives are documented here, different services, different things that you can do with AngularJS. So there's a lot of good, valuable information there, and there's a lot of people blogging about Angular as well. So there's a tremendous number of really good articles about specific topics with Angular out on the web there as well. Cool. Well, I appreciate your time, and I'd be glad. I'll try to get those code snippets out to you as soon as possible. Thank you for listening, and I hope it was worthwhile, and I hope you have great success in all your application development there.
Excellent. Dave, that was fantastic. Thank you very much for a brilliant overview, and respect if people use the promo code Baskin-13, they can learn even more. Definitely something I'm going to be looking into, and I would like to thank you for coming and presenting this fantastic overview on AngularJS to the LIDNUG members, and we most certainly hope to get you back again.
Great, thank you, appreciate it.
Pleasure, all ours.